Hello and welcome to this video and to this short and sweet opening course on the Kann defense. Yeah, this short and sweet was created, let's say, based on my Keep It Simple for Black course, which features every opening from Black's perspective, battling e4, d4, every move that White may play. And in this short and sweet, I'm going to show you the Caro Kann part of it, the weapon against 1e4. Before we continue, a few words about myself. I'm Sielecki, an international master from Germany. I'm a professional content creator nowadays for Chessable. I've released plenty of Chessable courses over the last 5 years. I've been there from the very beginning, and I've done some pioneering work for Chessable. The first video course, for example, with Keep It Simple 1e4. I've also created the first course that featured a quick starter guide. And here in the short and sweet, we will look at the Caro Kann. So an opening against 1e4, let's have a look. That is the Caro Kann. And that was the choice for my Keep It Simple for Black course. I think that these general considerations that I had for this Keep It Simple approach fit very well with the Caro Kann. What I'm looking for when I'm constructing a repertoire like that is an opening that is very dependable and solid. I don't want something fishy which can be refuted. It's a really, really good opening, high quality opening, but it should be possible to play it without memorizing like gazillions of moves and like deep sequences, lots of tactics. This is a little bit often too much to master if you want to learn an opening. I think it should be possible to do it with a bit less effort. And the Caro Kann works perfectly against 1e4 in that regard, because White doesn't really have all that many, let's say, tricky variations available. For example, if you make a comparison there, the move 1e5 is of course perfectly fine. It's the main move of almost all of the top players. But you have to see that if you don't play on the World Championship level, where they all play the Rui Lopez and the Italian in a very sophisticated manner, you have to also study all the gambits and wild stuff that they could throw at you. And this is really quite an effort to study. The Caro, on the other hand, has this absolute no-nonsense quality. Black plays c6, and next move will be d5, no matter what. And we have a solid pawn on d5 in the center. That also makes it very difficult for White to ever start an attack against the f7 square, for example, which you often see in e4, e5 openings. And what's more, the Caro is not only kind of no-nonsense, as I call it, in like stopping like silly or somewhat tricky attacks by White, but it also is absolutely non-symmetrical. That is a huge advantage if you want to play for a win. White doesn't have a very simple way of like trading pieces and making it boring. That's really not possible for White. So we get some interesting fighting positions without the necessity to learn like 20 move deep tactics right in the opening. So after c6, what does White play? The absolutely main move is d4, which is super logical, putting the second pawn in the center, the d4 pawn, this one, d4. But the other move the other approach that is also seen quite frequently is White getting the knights out into c3 and f3. That is also quite popular. I want to start out with what they call the classical variation. And that happens after d4, d5, when White now decides to cover the e-pawn. We attack White's e-pawn. If they decide to cover it with knight d2 or knight c3, very logical moves. And this is the classical way to play. Classical often means in chess, according to the like long accepted values, developing pieces, controlling the center, and knight c3 or knight d2 certainly fits that label. So we take on e4, white recaptures. And here black has quite a good choice of options, which is also good because now I'm going to show you a line that I like and I recommend, but it's always good to have alternatives for later changes that you might want to apply, or just to have some variety. And this is my move, knight f6, that I recommend, but black is also doing perfectly fine with bishop f5. That is also super popular. And there's also knight d7, which is a little bit less popular, but there's nothing fundamentally wrong with it either. My choice is knight f6 though, because I think of all the moves possible here, it is the simplest one for black to handle. We immediately attack the centralized knight and ask white about what they want to do with it. And quite obviously, they will probably trade on f6 and create a double pawn. Retreating the knight cannot be dangerous, so they take, and we take with the e-pawn. And this is interesting. Very early on here, after 5 moves, we have created a position, and very much voluntarily, with a double pawn. We have a doubled f-pawn. This is, however, not at all a problem. A double pawn sometimes has this reputation of being weak, but that's not really the case. A double pawn is usually weak when it's an isolated double pawn. So if we, for example, if we use our imagination, we have a doubled f-pawn, and we would imagine that the g-pawn wouldn't be there, like there would be no g7 pawn, then this would be an isolated f-pawn, doubled f-pawn. And those indeed would be weak. For example, if there is no g-pawn on the board, the f5 square would be weak forever. But that's not the case here. If the double pawn is part of one pawn block or one pawn island, as they also call it, they're not really an issue. In fact, here, the double pawn is very useful, and in particular useful if we think about square control. The double pawn controls very important squares. Think about e5 and g5. Those two squares can often be a real pain for black to deal with the knight coming to g5 or e5. Well, not here, right? The double pawn is very nice here in securing those squares. We also should mention that black, we will play bishop b6 and we will castle kingside, more or less the default next 2 moves. We have a very safe king position on the king side, as we have 4 pawns that shield the king. That is really often a huge attraction to this line, as our king is very safe. Even after we have castled, we can often use one of the pawns, like the f pawn or the h pawn in particular, to advance them and start some initiative on the king side. That is possible because we have 4 pawns that shield our king, so moving one of them forward is not creating much of a weakness. That is a very important point. Furthermore, if we look at this position from a pure piece perspective, think about piece activity and piece play and quality, all of our pieces can be developed easily. Bishop to d6, the bishop on c8 is actually not bad where it is on an open diagonal, but it can often go to e6, f5. Yeah, it depends a little bit on what white is doing, but it's also free to develop. The knight, of course, can jump to d7. Often it will actually regroup to the king side, because that is often where our play can be if white also goes to the king side. So we have a very easy development. We don't have any problem of the sort like, we have a somewhat weak bishop, let's say, that's kind of trapped or something. That's not the case. We have a very easy development here. You will very likely not lose due to a piece being bad out of the opening and never really entering the game. It's not happening. Also, we have a very standard way of continuing here. We will play the bishop to d6. We castle, often rook e8, knight d7. All those moves flow very naturally. And we don't really have to look at that much theory now, because that kind of standard way of developing works almost all of the time. I want to look at 2 continuations now. White playing knight f3, that's a very popular move, but not a very dangerous one, as if we check it, it mostly looks at squares that we have well protected. So you could argue that the knight is not even that great on f3, with some justification. It's not really doing all that much. It's, however, very popular, as developing the knight to f3 looks very, very natural. And I want to discuss a plan for white, because it's not all like black's position has upsides, but it also has a downside. And one downside of black's position, and I think the main one, we will see in this line here, illustrated, just to show the general idea. So we develop like this. Bishop to g4 is also a welcome pin. If we can play that, it's definitely desirable. And after some more moves, I want to show you one point. All very normal moves. And now the move c4. This is the idea that I wanted to show. This is a potential downside of black's position. If you look at the queen side, white has 4 pawns on that side of the board. We have 3. And this means white can try to use this pawn majority, as they call it, to maybe create a passed pawn. That would often be valuable in an endgame, for example, where they can create a pawn that marches forward trying to promote. This is a bit more difficult for black to do, creating a passed pawn, due to this doubled pawn construction. So if we enter a pure ending, just like a bishop ending, a knight ending, that could be potentially a bit more favorable for white, as they can do a little bit more with their pawns. That doesn't mean that those endings are lost. That would be too harsh. But in general, black is, if you look at this particular structure, more keen on putting pressure, let's say, on the d4 pawn than trading lots of pieces. We want to pressurize the center, because if they want to advance their pawns, they have to push them forward, and that also weakens them a little bit. If you compare the c4 with c3, which is also frequently seen strategy or setup, this is safer for sure. That's a pawn chain that we are not easily going to break, but it's also not very ambitious. How does white get this passed pawn on the road? Probably not. So c4 is more ambitious, but also weakens the d4 pawn quite a bit. This could be an idea for black, for example, here after rook e8 and the trade, we can play rook to d8, put pressure on this pawn. This is a sample variation for what could happen if white plays in this somewhat conservative way with knight f3, just developing. There are various ways of playing like this. It's not the only one, but you just have to know or understand what the general setup for black looks like. We play all our pieces on the natural squares, let's say. The bishop out here if possible, bishop to d6, knight d7. Here rook e8 challenges on the e-file. Every single piece is active, and here we would want to try to make pressure on the d4 pawn if they play like this. An idea for black that I mentioned before is, if we jump to this position, an idea for black can be to use the pawns on the king side. That would be interesting, for example, if white here decides to play bishop e2, and now f5 is definitely an option. The idea could be to free up the knight here for f6 and then to e4, or push the pawns even more forward. That is really possible. I have also had games myself, or I've seen games, where black later on really plays a real pawn storm, like h6, g5. This is very much dependent on the concrete position, of course. It's not a general plan that would work all of the time, but you have to see that with all the pawns around the black king, advancing on that side of the board is often a real option. We're not weakening our king position all that much because we have so many pawns around the king. So those positions are generally interesting to play when both sides castle king side. When we look at the start of the whole thing, like here, we have to talk about the critical test of the variation. It's clear that white should have some way to play for an advantage. Knight f3 is not the way. The reason why e takes f6 and this whole variation was unpopular for a very long time is this move, c3. However, some years ago, like 2015, 2016 around, a new idea for black was discovered, and that changed the whole view on the line here with knight f6 and e takes f6. I'm going to show you this line now. c3 is the critical test of the black opening setup. We play bishop d6 and white goes bishop d3, we castle, and now queen c2. That is the idea of c3. White very quickly builds up this battery against our king side. And up until this point, 6-7 years ago, black always played in the following way. Rook e8, that is still okay. We give this check and a move that fits into our setup anyway. Knight e2 played. And here, black always played either h6 or g6, but never managed to get reasonable chances. And it's easy to understand once you have a look at the moves. Like g6 wasn't great because white has an automatic attack here. That just looks immediately wrong. Then h6. Against h6, the problem was that after white castles kingside, they have this idea. And that is annoying. The knight comes to f5. You cannot really tolerate a knight on f5. That's just too dangerous. And black has no good way in this structure to play the move g6 and stop the knight from entering the square. As always, this is hanging. Oops, that was a bit weird here. So you cannot go g6 here to cover f5 as white is on that pawn, besides the fact that they maybe can sacrifice on g6. So here it's impossible to stop the knight from traveling all the way to f5, or it would create concessions that we don't really want to make. This is a position that black, it seems, cannot get equal chances from. So the consequence is we have to go back here and do something better. And the solution is the move h5. And that changes the whole view completely. The reason why this is so much better than h6 is revealed if you have a look at castling kingside now for white. If they do that, we play h4. And this is already the fundamental explanation why h5 is better. With h4 now on the board, we simply stop the knight from jumping to g3. And we have gained substantial space on the king side. That can often be helpful in the long run. In some cases, we might want to push the pawn all the way to h3, weakening white's king side. Or if they play h3, that is actually very popular reply for white, the most popular one, then we have also accomplished something. On a very good day, we might be able to even sacrifice the bishop on h3, of course, after due preparation. This position is very interesting, as here the knight on e2 is not doing all that much. It definitely cannot come to f5 easily. I think chances are equal here, and interesting. It's not at all a boring position. So this is something that we definitely don't mind having on the board. Going back, here, white has a fundamentally different option, which is probably the more dangerous one, or at least the more, let's say, testing one. If you say it's difficult to me to find the right word, but the one that is definitely more ambitious. Ambitious is probably the right word here. So I'm talking about bishop to e3 when they prepare queenside castling. That is definitely an option for white, thinking that h5 has, well, weakened black's kingside a little bit. It would be safer probably to have the pawn back, but we had to do it because we wanted to be ready for short castling. Still, this is leading to very interesting and sharp play. We play knight d7, as we usually do, and after castling queenside, we go to f8 with the knight. That at first looks a little bit passive, but it has more than one good reason behind it. We want to, first of all, make sure that the knight is not in the way. So we want to play bishop e6 and have this bishop on a good square. It would be difficult to manage that before traveling the knight to f8. But the more important point is that white has the option to attack on the king side with h3 and g4, and we need defenders. And the knight on f8 is a great defender of the king. We also need to be able to play the move g6 in some lines to make the king side a little bit more solid. And this is only possible if the knight is on that square. Otherwise, white would simply smash on g6. So here, white usually plays the move king to b1. Here on the next move, they are just aware that after bishop e6, we are on that a2 pawn, and white cannot easily play without king b1. So here bishop e6, and now white has tried mostly two ideas. One idea, which is the most popular one, is trying to play with c4 and trying to create a pass pawn. We've talked about this strategic long-term goal of white before. Definitely a popular option. The other idea that white may go for is attacking on the king side. And that would be usually accomplished by h3 and g4. At least that's the attempt to get the attack going. For that plan, what you have to remember, that is the only important thing to remember with this attack, is that if they play h3 and g4, we play h4 all the time. So let's say they play h3 and we play a move like b5, yeah, that's a good attacking move, securing those squares as well. If they play g4, we play h4. And there are various versions of this idea. White can play h3 before king b1, or yeah, so there are plenty of options when to go for this with white. But we have to remember that we never want to take on g4 and open the h file. That would be suicidal. If we play h4 though, we keep this side of the board quite closed. And with bishop d5 attacking this rook, we get some interesting options after the g-pawn has moved. So just remember, we don't open the king side at all for white. We play h4, keeping it closed. More often, I met c4, the central plan. When rook c8 is a good move, placing the rook opposite the queen, and now planning to play b5, fighting for some initiative on the queen side. We would also be very thrilled if white moves the c-pawn and gives us access to the d5 square. For example, after knight c3, or let's say h3, right? Let's do that first. h3, we would play b5. That is an important idea. Just want to show that. We would be happy if white advances, as we get control over d5 for the queen, for the bishop. Maybe also once the bishop has moved, knight can come to e6. This is a very typical idea. This is also why knight c3 is frequently seen here, making sure that b5 can be captured. I suggest bishop b4, intending to take, and then b5. That is a typical idea. We fight for the control of the light squares. If white has to move the c-pawn, we are in great shape. Yeah, something like that already looks, ooh, that was a weird arrow, already looks fantastic for black. Yeah, it's a very naive move, a3. So likely they will move the knight away when it is important to retreat the bishop in time before white manages c5 and then plants a knight to d6. So bishop e7. That is the final move that I wanted to show here. This has been tested quite a bit in practice, this position, and black was doing really well. We still have this b5 idea, which often prompts white, as they don't want to see that on the board, prompts white to retreat this again and actually offer, like without offering a draw, as bishop b4 would repeat the position. This is of course not necessary at all. We can easily continue with queen a5, for example, have the queen on active square, or a move like g6. You can play on, you don't have to make a draw here, absolutely not. Queen a5 is probably what I would do if I want to win the game. You can sometimes also just repeat once and see, do you really want to draw? And then they maybe make a move they don't want to make. Anyway, this is a good way to play for black. This is our approach in the classical Caro Kann, that line with e takes f6. Going back all the way here, I think this is a really nice opening variation to have in your repertoire. You have good pieces, active pieces, and it's really not so easy for white to make something out of this this majority on the queen side, this 4 against 3. It is really a very long time until this counts for something, and often black's games actually much easier to conduct. With the classical variation covered here with knight f6 and e takes f6, the so-called two knights variation, when white plays either this, two knights,